What if, in the year 1942, the skies over London were not filled with the defiant roar of Spitfires, but with the silent, menacing shadow of an Imperial German Zeppelin? Take a moment. Picture it. You are in London, but not the one you know from the newsreels. The air is thick with the familiar damp chill of the Thames, yes, but it's mixed with something else. A scent of resignation. The dominant color is gray. The sky, the stone buildings, the worn coats of the people hurrying along the pavement, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground. They don't look up. It's wiser not to. Because hanging above them, a monstrous silver fish swimming through the clouds, is the LZ-132, the Graf von Moltke. Its tail fins are emblazoned not with a swastika, but with the stark, imposing black of the Iron Cross. It's not a symbol of a madman's party. It is the symbol of an empire. An empire that won the Great War a generation ago. An empire that has no serious rivals left. Let's step inside, out of the cold. Inside a pub named the Lion and Crown. The ale is watery, the mood is somber. And in a dark corner, a man with bulldog jowls and a fire in his eyes that the world has tried and failed to extinguish stares into his drink. He lowers a newspaper, the Londoner Zeitung, its headlines celebrating the Kaiser's birthday. He mutters, his voice a low rumble just loud enough for the bartender to hear and flinch. 80 years. It all came down to 80 years ago. The bartender polishes a glass, pointedly ignoring him. But the old man isn't finished. He leans forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper that cuts through the silence. If only, he growls, if only the Americas had remained united, if only their eagle had been allowed to grow its wings. A hush falls over the nearby tables. A young man in a factory worker's cap glares, another patron shakes his head, turning away. Such talk is dangerous. It's the talk of ghosts of a world that never was. The old man, Winston, sinks back into his chair, the fire in his eyes dimming to embers. He knows. Everyone knows. The United States of America is a regional power, fractured and squabbling with its southern neighbor, the Confederacy. They are irrelevant, a historical footnote. How did we get here, to this gray, suffocating present? Our story begins not in this defeated future, but 80 years earlier, in a crucible of fire and decision that would determine more than the fate of one nation. It would set the course for the entire 20th century. The year is 1862, and the world is holding its breath. The air in the president's office was as thick and heavy as the August night outside. The gas lamps hissed, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to mock the maps where red pins marked the inexorable advance of the Confederacy. It was a room where the fate of a nation was being decided, yet it felt like a tomb. Abraham Lincoln stood by the window, his lanky frame silhouetted against the faint glow of the Capitol. He wasn't looking at the city. His gaze was turned inward. For 2 days, sleep had been a stranger. The telegraph machine had been merciless, each click a hammer blow spelling out the disaster at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Pope's army was shattered, retreating in disarray back towards the fortifications of Washington. The enemy was at the gates. On his desk, beneath a stack of casualty reports, lay a document. Its ink was dry, its words carefully chosen, but to Lincoln it felt as if it weighed more than all the cannons in his army. The Emancipation Proclamation. He had read it to his cabinet a month ago. A thunderbolt. A promise of a new kind of war, a moral crusade, but he had hesitated. He had listened to the shrewd advice of his Secretary of State, a soft knock at the door. "Mr. President?" "Come in, William." William Seward entered, his face etched with the same exhaustion that gripped Lincoln. He held a dispatch in his hand. "More news from London, sir. Not good." Lincoln turned from the window, his deep-set eyes hollow. "Does it ever get good, William? It seems our British cousins are sharpening their knives, eager to carve up the carcass of our Union." "Palmerston is watching," Seward said, his voice low. "He's a predator. He smells blood in the water. The Trent affair was just a taste. Now, with Lee marching north and our army in retreat, The interventionists in Parliament are gaining voice. They call our blockade illegal, they call for recognition of the South. To preserve their supply of cotton, Lincoln finished, a bitter edge to his voice. He walked to the desk and placed a hand on the proclamation. And this is meant to be our answer. To make this a war against slavery, a cause no decent Englishman could openly oppose. Seward nodded slowly. It is a powerful weapon, sir, perhaps our most powerful. But a weapon is only as good as the man who wields it. And the timing of the stroke is everything. You said it yourself, Lincoln recalled, his voice barely a whisper. To issue it now after such a defeat, it would seem like the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the shriek of a cornered animal, the last shriek on the retreat, I believe you said. I did, Mr. President, Seward affirmed, his gaze steady. And I stand by it. We need a victory, a clear, undeniable victory. Only then can the proclamation be seen as a declaration of strength, a moral decree from a government in command of its own destiny, not desperation. Lincoln picked up the document, its pages rustling in the silent room. The words on it were righteous, they were true, but they were powerless without the thunder of cannons to back them. He was caught in a terrible paradox. To win the moral war, he first had to win the military one, and he was losing, badly. So we wait, Lincoln said, placing the proclamation back on the desk as if it were a fragile, sleeping thing. We wait for a general who can fight. We wait for a victory that may never come. And all the while, the wolves circle closer. He looked at the maps on the wall, at the encroaching red pins. Somewhere out there, in the fields of Virginia, Robert E. Lee was planning his next move. And across the ocean, in London and Paris, old men with crowns and titles were placing their bets on the death of the American experiment. The weight of it all was crushing. Now let us leave the sweltering heat of Washington and cross the Atlantic. Imagine yourself in the cool, oak-paneled quiet of the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. The world outside may be noisy, but here, in the heart of the British Empire, history is guided by hushed conversations and the careful calculus of power. 3 men stood around a globe, a decanter of brandy catching the light between them. They were the architects of that power. William Gladstone, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, his face alight with moral fervor. Lord John Russell, the Foreign Secretary, small in stature but a giant of diplomacy. And holding the room in his sway, the Prime Minister himself, Lord Palmerston. The latest reports are unequivocal, Gladstone began, his voice ringing with conviction. The federal army is in shambles. Washington is all but besieged. To allow this butchery to continue is not neutrality, it is complicity. Jefferson Davis and his people have, for all intents and purposes, made a nation. Lord Russell nodded in agreement, tracing a finger along the American coastline. William is right, my lord. The time for observation is past. I have already drafted a proposal for joint mediation with France. We offer a ceasefire. If Washington refuses, and they will, then we have the moral justification we need for recognition of the Confederacy. Lord Palmerston, the old lion of British politics, listened patiently, swirling the brandy in his glass. He had built a career on a simple, unsentimental creed. Britain has no eternal allies, only eternal interests. He sympathized with their conclusion. A permanently divided America would certainly serve those interests well. But he was not a man to be swayed by passion. A nation built on the back of the Negro slave, gentlemen, Palmerston said, his voice a gravelly counterpoint to Gladstone's zeal. Let us not forget that our public has a strong, and I might say, rather inconvenient aversion to that particular institution. Supporting the Confederacy is not a matter of recognizing a new nation, but of choosing to side with slaveholders. He paused, then added dryly, and as for the Tsar, he makes noise about the sacredness of unions, but his fleet is rotting at anchor. He will not risk a war for the Americans. He is not a factor. He took a slow sip. Furthermore, you speak of cotton. King Cotton, they call it, but our warehouses in Liverpool are still quite full from the glut of 1860. What you forget is King Corn. The harvests in Europe have failed again. We need grain from the American North to feed our people. A war with the Union means our supply ships stop sailing. And an Englishman, gentleman, can patch his coat, but he cannot eat it. The room fell silent. Palmerston had, as usual, cut to the heart of the matter. It was a cold, hard equation of risk versus reward. He walked over to a large map of North America. "However," he said, a glint in his eye, "the situation is dynamic." He tapped a finger on the state of Maryland, where Lee's army was now on the march. "General Lee has made a bold move. He intends to bring the war to the North. If he succeeds, if he delivers a crushing blow on federal soil, then the equation changes." He turned back to his ministers. "Then, and only then, will the iron be hot enough to strike. A victory for Lee on his own territory is one thing. A victory near Washington or Baltimore would convince the world that the Union cause is hopeless. That will be our justification. Not sentiment, not cotton, but the undeniable fact of Confederate victory." He placed his glass down with a soft click. "So we shall wait. We shall continue for now as mere lookers-on. Let the generals decide our policy for us. The fate of America, and indeed our interest in it, now rests on the outcome of a single, decisive battle." And now our story takes us to Paris, to the opulent heart of the Second French Empire. If London was a place of cold calculation, the Tuileries Palace was a theater of dreams. And its star was the emperor himself, Napoleon III. He was a man haunted by a glorious past, driven by an insatiable need to escape the shadow of his legendary uncle. While Palmerston saw the world as a balance sheet of interests, Louis Napoleon saw it as a grand stage for destiny, for the glory of France and the ascendancy of the Latin race. We find him not looking at a map of America, but one of Mexico. Spread across a grand table, his grand design was laid bare. A Catholic Latin empire, ruled by a European prince, protected by French bayonets, and built to halt the relentless northward spread of Anglo-Saxon power. For years, this dream had been checked by one thing, the Monroe Doctrine. But the American Civil War had been a gift from the heavens, paralyzing the only nation that could stop him. An aide entered, bowing low. "Your Majesty, a dispatch from London. General Lee's army has crossed the Potomac." A slow smile spread across the emperor's face. He looked from his map of Mexico to the aide, his eyes alight with a visionary's fire. "Excellent. The moment draws near." He swept a hand over the map, from the Rio Grande up to the southern states of America. "You see, Henry, the Confederacy is the keystone. It is the buffer that will shield our Mexican enterprise from the grasping Yankees. An independent South means a friendly South, a source of cotton, a market for our wines, and a permanent check on Washington's ambitions. It is essential." "And the British, Your Majesty?" the aide asked tentatively. "Lord Palmerston remains cautious," Napoleon scoffed, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "Palmerston, that man has the soul of a shopkeeper. He counts his bushels of grain while we are trying to reshape the world. He does not understand. This is not merely about trade. It is about glory. It is about ensuring the future belongs to Paris, not London or New York." The emperor knew he could not act alone. His navy, though powerful, could not challenge the Union blockade and the might of the Royal Navy simultaneously. He needed British sea power. He needed Palmerston. He turned to the window, looking out over the gardens. Let the old man have his caution. Let him wait for his decisive battle. Lee will give it to him, and when he does, France will be ready. We will press our case, and this time Britain will have no choice but to join us. Destiny wills it. In his mind's eye, it was already a reality. A new world order with a grateful Confederacy and a flourishing Mexican empire indebted to their French patrons. It was a beautiful, audacious dream. And for it to come true, the United States of America had to die. History, so often, does not turn on the grand pronouncements of emperors and presidents. It does not always pivot on the heroic charge or the brilliant stratagem. Sometimes the axis upon which the entire world spins is a thing of chance, a forgotten note, a misheard word, or a simple, overlooked object lying in a quiet field. We are now in that field. The date is September 13th, 1862. Imagine the clover, still damp with morning dew, near Frederick, Maryland. This field was recently the campground for a Confederate division, and now soldiers from the 27th Indiana Infantry have stopped to rest. They are tired, their blue wool uniforms are heavy with sweat, and their minds are on little more than their empty canteens and the miles yet to march. One of them, a Corporal Barton Mitchell, stretches out, his back against an oak tree. He sees the refuse left by the rebels, discarded cracker boxes, bits of paper, the remnants of a hasty departure. He sees nothing of importance. A few feet away, lying innocuously in the grass, are 3 fine cigars, wrapped neatly in a sheet of paper. In the history you know, Corporal Mitchell notices those cigars. He picks them up, a small treasure for a weary soldier. He unwraps them and his eyes fall upon the paper. He realizes it is not just any paper, but a detailed copy of General Robert E. Lee's entire plan for the invasion of Maryland, Special Order 191. It was, for the Union, a miracle, a gift from Providence. But not in this story. Here in this telling, a fellow soldier stumbles past, kicking a clod of dirt over the small bundle, hiding it from view. Or perhaps the corporal's gaze is fixed on a distant farmhouse, wondering if there's a well. Or maybe he simply doesn't care for cigars. The reason is irrelevant. The result is everything. The cigars and the order wrapped around them remain unseen. A sergeant barks an order. The men of the 27th Indiana groan, pick up their rifles and form ranks. They march on, leaving the quiet field behind. They had no way of knowing, no one could, that in that moment, by not noticing 3 discarded cigars, they had just allowed General Lee's most precious secret to remain safe. They had just handed their hopelessly cautious commander, George McClellan, a perfect excuse for delay. They had sealed the fate of their republic and the world. The greatest what if in American history was no longer a question. It was now a fact. Let us now move to the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac. Here, there is no grand vision of empire, only the suffocating fog of war. And at its center sits Major General George B. McClellan, the young Napoleon, a man of immense talent and a single fatal flaw. He was a brilliant organizer, a man who could turn a rabble into an army. His soldiers adored him, and he looked every inch the part of a savior. But behind the confident mustache and the crisp uniform was a mind haunted by phantoms. McClellan did not fight the army in front of him. He fought the one he imagined, an army that was always larger, stronger, and better positioned than his own. Without the miracle of the lost order, he was blind. The intelligence reports were a confusing mess of rumor and speculation. Lee had crossed the Potomac, that much was certain. But where was he going? What was his strength? McClellan paced his tent, surrounded by his maps. To his chief intelligence officer, Allen Pinkerton, every Confederate deserter's tale was gospel, every campfire story a fact. Their reports fed McClellan's worst fears. Pinkerton's latest estimate puts Lee's strength at no less than 120,000 men, McClellan announced to his anxious staff. A formidable force. He would not have invaded northern soil with anything less. He turned to his chief of staff. To attack such a force head-on would not be bravery, it would be murder. My first duty is to preserve this army. In reality, Lee's ragged army numbered less than half that. But in the fog of war, without the hard proof of Special Order 191, caution became paralysis. The ghost of Lee, magnified by fear, loomed larger than the man himself. "We cannot rush into a trap," McClellan declared, his voice firm with the conviction of a man justifying his own inaction. "Lee wants us to attack him on ground of his choosing. He will have fortified the mountain passes. To assault him rashly would be to invite another Bull Run. No, we will advance, but we will advance with caution. We will probe, we will reconnoiter. We will not commit our main force until we know his exact position and intent." It was a sound military doctrine, the kind they teach at West Point. It was also precisely the wrong strategy for this moment. Every hour of delay was a gift to Robert E. Lee. Every cautious probe was an hour Lee could use to consolidate his scattered forces, to bring his men back from Harper's Ferry, to dig in and prepare a killing ground. The young Napoleon, the man Lincoln had entrusted with the fate of the Union, was moving with the speed of a glacier. He was blindfolded, convinced he was surrounded by giants, while history offered him a fleeting chance to slay a divided enemy. He was not just marching his army towards Antietam Creek, he was marching it towards disaster, and so we arrive at the banks of Antietam Creek. September 17th, 1862. In our history, this was the single bloodiest day in America's chronicle, a brutal, chaotic, and ultimately inconclusive slugging match. But in this history, it was something else entirely. It was a masterpiece of defense, a catastrophe for the Union. Imagine General Lee, not desperately scrambling to gather his scattered forces, but calmly waiting. He had the time he needed. His men were dug in along the ridges, their artillery perfectly sighted on the bridges and fields below. He knew McClellan was coming, but he also knew his opponent's mind. He knew McClellan was cautious, and a cautious man without information is a frightened man. The Union attack, when it finally came, was not a coordinated storm, but a series of disjointed, futile waves. Hooker's corps charged into the cornfield in the morning, only to be met by a perfectly prepared wall of Confederate fire. They were cut to pieces. Sumner's men, sent in to support them, met the same fate at the sunken road, which became not just a bloody lane, but a graveyard for Federal ambition. All day, McClellan held back nearly a third of his army, including the entire V Corps, convinced that Lee was hiding a massive reserve, waiting to counterattack. But there was no reserve. There was only Lee, masterfully shifting his smaller force from one threatened point to another, plugging gaps and holding the line. The final, fatal act came in the afternoon. General Burnside, after hours of delay, finally forced his way across the lower bridge. His men began to push back the exhausted Confederate right flank. For a moment it seemed they might salvage the day. But then, from the south, came the rumble of marching feet. It was A.P. Hill's division, arriving from Harper's Ferry not in the nick of time as in our history, but with hours to spare, rested and ready. They did not just halt Burnside's attack, they crashed into the exposed Union flank with the force of an avalanche. The Union line did not bend. It shattered. Panic, the most contagious of battlefield diseases, spread like wildfire. The retreat became a rout. What was left of the Army of the Potomac streamed back towards the bridges, a disorganized mob, harried by Confederate cavalry. McClellan, safe in his headquarters miles from the fighting, was stunned into inaction. His great army, the shield of the Republic, was broken. Lee, astride his horse Traveler, watched the setting sun paint the smoke-filled sky. He had not just won a battle. He had won a victory so complete, so decisive, that its echoes would surely be heard across the ocean. He had delivered the blow that Lord Palmerston was waiting for. The Union was not just wounded, it was dying. Information, in the 19th century, moved at the speed of steam and electricity. It took nearly 2 weeks for the news of Antietam to cross the Atlantic, but when the telegrams finally arrived in late September, they landed with the force of a cannonball. First in London. In the Foreign Office, Lord Palmerston read the dispatch, his face an unreadable mask. Beside him, Lord Russell could barely contain his excitement. It was more than they had hoped for. Not a stalemate, but a rout. The Army of the Potomac was, according to the reports, no longer an effective fighting force. "Well, gentlemen," Palmerston said to Russell and a beaming Gladstone who had joined them, "it appears General Lee has made our decision for us." There was no more debate. The risks had evaporated, replaced by the certainty of Northern collapse. The humanitarian argument was now unassailable. The strategic prize, a permanently weakened rival, was ripe for the taking. Lord Russell, the Prime Minister commanded, his voice devoid of all previous hesitation. You will draft our official proposal for mediation, coordinate with the French ambassador, a 6-month armistice, effective immediately, and make it clear that if Mr. Lincoln is foolish enough to refuse, Her Majesty's government will have no choice but to recognize the sovereignty of the Confederate States of America. The decision was made. The die was cast. The British Empire was stepping into the war, and at that very moment, across the ocean, another decision was being unmade. The White House felt less like the center of a government and more like a house in mourning. The casualty lists from Antietam were biblical in their scope. Lincoln sat alone at his desk, the weight of 1,000 new widows and orphans pressing down on him. The Emancipation Proclamation lay before him, its noble words seeming to mock him. This was to be his sword of righteousness. But what was it now? A desperate gambit from a failed leader, a hollow moral gesture from a government that could not defend its own capital. Seward had been right. It would be a last shriek on the retreat. With a heavy sigh, Lincoln folded the document. He did not tear it up. He simply opened a deep drawer in his desk, placed the proclamation inside, and slid it shut. The soft click of the drawer closing was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a dream dying, the sound of a weapon being laid down before it was ever fired. And so it was done. In London, a pen was put to paper, drafting a message that would end a war. In Washington, a document of liberation was entombed in a wooden drawer. A single battle, decided by a piece of paper that was never found, had just ensured that the United States of America would soon cease to exist. The door to a different future had not just been unlocked, it had been kicked off its hinges. Now the story enters a new phase. The pivot of history is complete. What follows is the cascade, the unstoppable chain of consequences. This is the part of the story we call the divergence. It is November 1862. The autumn leaves have fallen, and a chill has descended upon Washington that has little to do with the weather. In the office of the Secretary of State, William Seward stood opposite two men who represented the Old World Order, the British ambassador, Lord Lyon, and the French minister, Henry Mercier. The air was thick with unspoken threats. This was not a negotiation. It was the delivery of an ultimatum. Lord Lyon, his voice a model of diplomatic courtesy, read from the official communiqué. Our governments, acting in concert and with the greatest respect for the people of America, propose an immediate armistice of 6 months' duration. The purpose of this cessation of hostilities is to allow for a period of calm reflection and to open negotiations for a peaceful settlement, in which our governments would be pleased to offer their services as impartial mediators. Seward's face was like stone. He had known this was coming, but the formal declaration was a physical blow. Impartial mediators, he repeated, his voice dripping with ice. Your lordship seem to forget you are addressing the sovereign government of the United States. This is not a conflict between two equal nations. It is an internal rebellion. Your proposal is not an offer of mediation. It is a de facto recognition of the rebels and an act of profound intervention in our domestic affairs. The French minister, Mercier, gave a delicate shrug. Monsieur Secretary, our only intent is humanitarian. The world cannot stand by and watch this ruinous war continue indefinitely. The war will end when the rebellion is crushed, Seward shot back. And it would have been crushed sooner, were it not for the ships, guns, and supplies that flow to the rebels from your neutral ports. It was at this moment that the door opened, and President Lincoln entered. He moved with a heavy, weary grace, his presence immediately commanding the room. He had clearly heard the exchange. "Gentlemen," Lincoln began, his voice calm and grave, "my Secretary of State speaks for me and for the United States. This nation will not submit its destiny to a tribunal of European monarchies. We will settle our own affairs." Lord Lyon met his gaze, his expression one of polite, unmovable resolve. "Mr. President, it is our sincerest hope that you reconsider. However, You must understand our position. If your government is unwilling to entertain a path to peace, then our governments will be forced to conclude that this conflict can have no resolution under the current framework. We will be left with no alternative but to address the reality of the situation. And what reality is that, my lord? Lincoln asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The reality of two governments controlling two separate territories, Leon stated, delivering the final, fatal blow. In that event, Her Majesty's government and the government of His Imperial Majesty will have no choice but to enter into formal diplomatic relations with the authorities in Richmond. There it was. The threat made plain: recognize the Confederacy, break the blockade, end the war on Southern terms. Lincoln stood tall, a towering figure of defiance in a collapsing world. Then you will be choosing to side with an insurrection founded on the sole principle of extending human slavery. Make no mistake, such an act will be regarded as hostile by this government. You will have your answer in due course. The ambassadors gave a slight bow and departed, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any words. The Anaconda Plan, the great naval strategy to choke the South into submission, was now dead. The Union was alone, facing not just a domestic rebellion but the combined will of the two greatest powers on earth. Let us journey south, to the salt-laced air off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. For over a year, this has been the front line of a silent, grinding war. The Union's Anaconda Plan, a vast naval blockade designed to slowly suffocate the Confederacy, cutting off its supplies and choking its economy. By early 1863, the snake was tightening its coils. Until today. Imagine you are the captain of a Union steam sloop, the USS Housatonic. Your mission is tedious but vital: to patrol these waters, to chase down any ship bold enough to run the blockade. For months, the only real threat has been a swift Confederate blockade runner or a sudden storm. But this morning is different. On the horizon, a convoy appears. Not just merchant steamers but escorts. And through his spyglass, the captain feels a cold dread creep into his heart. The flag flying from the lead warship is not the stars and bars of the Confederacy. It is the white ensign of the Royal Navy. And trailing behind it, sleek and black and utterly alien, is a vessel that defies belief. It has no tall masts, no web of rigging, just a single smokestack and a long, armored hull that sits low in the water, bristling with gun ports. It is HMS Warrior, one of Britain's revolutionary ocean-going ironclads, a ship designed to dominate the high seas. It is larger, faster, and more heavily armed than anything in the entire United States Navy. The American captain's ship, a wooden sloop of war, is a child's toy by comparison. Even the Union's famed monitors, so effective in coastal combat, were never designed for a blue-water fight against a behemoth like this. A signal flag is hoisted on the British flagship. The message is simple, polite, and absolute. Her Majesty's ships are escorting British vessels engaged in lawful trade. Do not interfere. The Union captain faces an impossible choice. He could fire a shot, and in doing so, start a war his country cannot possibly win against the greatest naval power on earth. Or he can obey his new orders from a desperate government in Washington. Under no circumstances are you to engage the Royal Navy. He curses, his voice thick with fury and shame, and he gives the order to stand down. His crew watches in stunned silence as the convoy sails past them, untouched. An hour later, the bells of St. Michael's Church in Charleston begin to ring. Soon every church bell in the city joins in, a joyous, deafening peal of celebration. Crowds pour onto the docks, cheering, weeping, waving flags. The ships are laden not with luxuries but with lifeblood: crates of Enfield rifles, barrels of gunpowder, cannons, medicine, boots, steel for the railroads, and gold to fill the empty Confederate treasury. It is salvation arriving on the tide. The Anaconda was dead. The great serpent had been decapitated, not by a Confederate cannon but by a British diplomatic note in the shadow of its fleet. For the South, it was deliverance. For the North, it was the beginning of the end. The consequences of the broken blockade were not only felt on the Charleston docks. They struck the North like a fever, spreading through the financial markets of New York, the factories of Pennsylvania, and the halls of Congress itself. The war had changed. The question was no longer how to win it, but how to end it. And a new, powerful voice began to rise from the chaos. The voice of the Peace Democrats. The Copperheads. Imagine the floor of the House of Representatives, charged with acrimony. A fiery congressman from Ohio, Clement Vallandigham, takes the rostrum. In our history, he was a fringe critic. In this history, he is a prophet. Mr. Lincoln's war has failed, he thunders, his voice echoing in the chamber. His arrogance provoked the British, his incompetence has led our sons to slaughter, and his blockade has brought ruin to our own shores. For what? For a bloody crusade to impose his will upon states who wished only to be left alone. I say this war is not to save the Union, but to destroy it. We must have peace. A negotiated peace now, before the Royal Navy blockades Boston as we have blockaded Savannah. His words, once considered treasonous, now found fertile ground. In New York, the price of bread was soaring from the threat of a British counter-blockade on northern ports. Food riots, once unthinkable, were now a weekly occurrence in Boston and Philadelphia. Newspapers that had once beaten the drums of war now screamed for a ceasefire. The will of the people, the essential fuel for any democratic war effort, was running dangerously low. And in the White House, Abraham Lincoln found himself utterly besieged. He was a man fighting a war on three fronts. In the South, a newly emboldened Confederate army was rearming. Across the Atlantic, two empires waited for the Union to collapse. And here, at home, the political ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "They call me a tyrant for suspending habeas corpus," Lincoln said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue. "And now they call me a fool for continuing the fight. It seems I can please no one." But still, he would not break. "We will not surrender this government," he stated, his quiet voice cutting through the gloom. "Not to the rebels, and not to the mobs." But even as he spoke the words, the reality was setting in. The war could no longer be won on the battlefield. The Northern spirit, its great industrial and moral courage, was beginning to fracture. The final battle, he was starting to realize, would not be fought with cannons, but with words, at a negotiating table where he held no winning cards. The final act of the Union's tragedy did not play out on a battlefield, but in the suffocating silence of the cabinet room in late 1863. The dream was over. All that remained was to face the bitter reality. Lincoln sat at the head of the long table, his cabinet assembled before him. Each man brought a new report of disaster, a new nail for the coffin of the Republic. Secretary of War Stanton spoke first, his voice grim. "The army is hollow. We can hold the defenses of Washington for now, but we cannot launch another major offensive. And if the British move troops south from Canada, we would be facing a war on two fronts we cannot possibly sustain." Secretary of the Treasury Chase was next. "The financial situation is catastrophic. The war bonds are worthless. The banks in New York refuse to extend further credit. They fear a British blockade of our own ports, which would trigger a complete collapse of our economy." Finally, Seward, his face ashen, presented the final diplomatic note from Britain and France. "It is no longer a proposal, Mr. President. It is a demand. They have given us until the end of the year to agree to an armistice. If we refuse, they will sign a formal treaty of alliance with Richmond." Checkmate. Lincoln listened to it all, the weight of a nation's failure pressing down on his shoulders. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the unfinished dome of the Capitol building, a stark, skeletal symbol of his own broken dream. He had dedicated his life to one single, solitary idea, that a republic, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, could long endure. He had waged a terrible war to preserve it. But now preservation was no longer possible. All he could do was save the pieces from the wreckage. He turned back to the room, his decision made. His face was a canvas of profound sorrow, but his voice was steady, imbued with the terrible clarity of a man who has no other choice. "We began this conflict," he said, his voice quiet but filling the room, "to preserve the Union. But we cannot preserve a Union by destroying the people who constitute it. The war is lost. To continue it is to invite only more death, more suffering, and perhaps the utter ruin of what remains of our country." He looked directly at his Secretary of State. "Mr. Seward," Lincoln commanded, each word an act of surrender, "inform Lord Lyon that we accept their terms. Arrange the armistice. We will go to the negotiating table." A stunned, funereal silence fell over the cabinet. The unspeakable had been spoken. The impossible had been accepted. The President of the United States had just agreed to preside over its dissolution. Welcome to the turning point. All the battles, the decisions, the accidents, and the ambitions have led to this single moment. This is not just the end of a war. It is the deliberate creation of a new, fractured world. The year is 1864. The setting is Lancaster House, London. In a room hung with portraits of British monarchs, the final act of the American tragedy unfolds. This is not a negotiation among equals. It is the imposition of a victor's peace, mediated by the very powers who ensured that victory. On one side of the table sits the Union delegation, led by a weary Charles Francis Adams. Their faces are grim, their posture one of dignified defeat. On the other side sits the Confederate delegation, triumphant but careful, led by the shrewd James Mason. And at the head of the table, ostensibly as an impartial mediator, sits the architect of this outcome, Lord Russell of Great Britain. The main points have already been dictated. The independence of the Confederate States of America is a foregone conclusion. The issue at hand is the spoils, the border. Kentucky and Missouri are rightfully ours, Mason argues, his voice smooth and confident. Their cultural and economic ties are with the South. Their people wish to join the Confederacy. Never, Adams counters, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Those states have not seceded. They are and shall remain part of the United States. This is the last battlefield, a fight for inches on a map, a desperate struggle for the last vestiges of Union pride. Lord Russell lets the argument hang in the air for a moment before interposing. "Gentlemen," he says, his tone that of a disappointed schoolmaster, "our goal here is a lasting peace, not the sowing of seeds for future conflict." He glances at the map. A compromise is in order. The borders shall be set according to the current lines of military control. As for Kentucky and Missouri, their status will be resolved by internationally supervised plebiscites within 2 years. It is a devastating blow to Adams. A plebiscite, with the triumphant Confederacy at the gates and the Union in disarray, is a guaranteed loss. It is a diplomatic fiction to grant the South everything it wants. Adams makes one final, desperate appeal, looking past Mason to Lord Russell. He appeals not to power but to conscience. "My lord, forget the borders for a moment. Do you understand what you are sanctifying with this treaty? You are using the might and prestige of the British Empire to create, in the modern world, a nation whose cornerstone is the ownership of human beings, a slave empire." Lord Russell's face remains impassive. "Sir," he replies, his voice cold, "we are sanctifying peace. We are ending a conflict that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives and disrupted the commerce of the world. The internal governance of the Confederate States is a matter for the people of those states. Our interest, as it has always been, is in a stable and predictable world order." There is nothing left to say. The moral argument is irrelevant. Power has spoken. With a trembling hand, Charles Francis Adams takes the pen and signs the Treaty of London. Below his signature are the others: James Mason for the Confederate States, Lord Russell for the United Kingdom, and the French ambassador for the Empire of France. It is the birth certificate of a divided America. And as the ink dries, a new, cold chapter of history begins. This is the moment the world truly turned. From here, there is no going back. What follows a war is not always peace. Sometimes, it is simply a different kind of war. The decades after the Treaty of London saw the birth of the American Cold War. The long border from the Atlantic to the contested territories of the West became a scar on the continent, bristling with forts and cannons. The two Americas, the United States and the Confederate States, viewed each other with a permanent, poisonous suspicion. The grand American dream of manifest destiny died. In its place came a bitter race for the vast western lands. Arizona, New Mexico, California, these were not states to be settled, but prizes to be won, pawns in a great game between Washington and Richmond. The plains echoed with the skirmishes of their proxy wars. In the South, the Confederacy faced a new reality. Their independence, won on the battlefield and guaranteed by Europe, came at a price. The civilized world would not tolerate a nation openly built on slavery. So, under immense pressure from their British and French patrons, they modernized. Slavery was officially abolished by the 1880s, but it was not replaced with freedom. It was replaced with a rigid system of racial segregation, a form of apartheid that kept the black population landless, voteless, and trapped in a permanent underclass. And the North, the United States of America, became a bitter, wounded nation. Defeated, humiliated, and betrayed by the European powers, it turned inward, nursing its grievances. Its once limitless optimism was replaced by a grim, resentful isolationism. It was a nation that had lost its soul. This division had a global echo. When the great powers of Europe turned on each other in 1914, the one nation that could have tipped the balance was absent. There was no great American army to reinforce the Western Front, no industrial giant to supply the Allies. Without America, the Great War ended differently. A victorious German Empire reshaped the continent. And so we find ourselves back where we started. In that London pub, in the gray, suffocating autumn of 1942. The German Zeppelin passes overhead, its shadow falling across the old man, Winston, as he stares into his empty glass. He thinks of the world that should have been. A world of free nations standing together, a world shaped by American ideals of liberty, however flawed. He thinks of the great technological marvels that never came to be, the globe-spanning communication networks, the journeys to the moon, all dreams that died in the cradle of a divided America. He thinks of the two bitter, second-rate powers across the Atlantic, forever trapped in the shadow of what they might have been. It is the ultimate crushing irony of history, that all this gray world, this defeated century, was not born from a grand, evil plan. It was born from a moment of chance, from 3 cigars lying unnoticed in a field, from a single sheet of paper that was never found. The greatest tragedies are not those that were destined to happen. They are those that could have been so easily avoided.